Friends, this is our third session on general exceptions in the Indian Penal Code. Today, I shall speak to you on sections 85 to 89 of the IPC. We have done 75, 75 to 79, 79 to 84, and today we'll do 85 to 89. But whatever we do, any lesson on general exceptions that we study, we have to at first, every single time, understand something very clearly, and that is, what is the impact or import of these exceptions, right? The impact of these exceptions has been defined in section 6 of the IPC, which says, you see, it's not practical to have exceptions for every single offense. There are 511 sections in the IPC. We cannot have an exception attached to each and every one. So there is a general chapter on exceptions. And these exceptions form the defense to the offenses. Right? So it has been understood that whatever offense is committed, which is listed in the Indian Penal Code, the general exceptions form a defense in court against the accusation of the offense which has been committed. The offense can be anything. The offense can be murder, it can be theft, it can be kidnapping, it can be causing grievous hurt, or it can be forgery, or it can be cheating, whatever. In every case, the general exceptions provide one or the other provision which can be used as a defense. So instead of listing one general exception with every offense, there's a full section on general exceptions which stand for the entire IPC. But whenever an accused is taking recourse to a general exception by way of his defense, the burden of proving that the exception is valid, that there were circumstances in the commission of the offense which bring it under the ambit of the general exception, this burden of proof is upon the accused. So if I say that, I slapped a certain man because I was ordered by the court to slap him, then I have to prove that there was a valid court order, a direction addressed to me, directing me to slap such and such a man. The prosecution's job would only be to prove that I slapped the man, and evidence to that effect. If I have to save myself by taking recourse of a general exception, namely a mandate of the court, it is I who have to prove that such a mandate indeed existed and was a mandate for the specific purpose of slapping the man who was slapped. Now we move on. Section 85. What does it say? Suppose somebody has been intoxicated. He has been given large doses of alcohol or morphine or opium or whatever, or LSD or ecstasy, I don't know, what else, against his will. That person did not want to imbibe that intoxicant, but he was either cheated into taking it or compelled to take it, or unknowingly it was given to him and mixed up into something and he took it. For whatever reason, it was given to him without his knowledge and he didn't ask for it, against his will. So two components. If an intoxicant, say alcohol, has been pumped into a man either because he didn't know that he was being given alcohol mixed in Coca-Cola or whatever, and he, poor chap, didn't understand, or he was forced to have it against his will. If that is the situation, and he's become so intoxicated, he becomes so inebriated, he's so drunk that he neither knows the nature of his act. That suppose I am totally, a person X is totally intoxicated, he is so badly intoxicated that he picks up a stone or a baseball bat to hit somebody in the leg. Now, he doesn't even know that he's actually picking up a baseball bat and he's hitting somebody. He's that badly intoxicated. Or else, he does not know that picking up the bat and hitting somebody is either wrong or it is against the law. So in intoxication, he has either lost his capacity to think as to what he is doing, or even if he can comprehend what he is doing, he can no way make out that it is illegal or it is wrong. Now, friends, a very interesting thing. Virtually, this is the exact definition when you find in a general exception for the defense of insanity. Insanity also, you will find that the same language was used. Incapable of knowing the nature of the act, or that what he is doing is either wrong or contrary to the law. The only addition here is that the intoxicating substance was given to him without his knowledge or against his will. But the rest of it is as per insanity. What does it mean? If so much intoxicant is imbibed, if so much of the alcohol or afim or whatever is taken, cocaine or whatever, heroin is taken against the person's will or not to his knowledge, that person, like an insane man, like a man of totally unsound mind, no longer understands what he is doing, or even if he can make out what he is doing, he no longer understands, he has no knowledge that it is either wrong or it is against the law. This is a very important point, friends. The degree of intoxication has to be exactly of the amount which would make him equal to a person of completely unsound mind. When he reaches that stage, then alone, this defense is available to him, with the addition that in reaching this stage, what he took was either given to him without his knowledge, or despite his saying, "Mujhe nahi chahiye, I don't want it," he was forced to have it. Right. So we move on. So as I said, he should have been intoxicated without his knowledge. He should be actually intoxicated at the time of committing the offense. And what is the degree of that intoxication? He has no idea what I am doing, or whether it is wrong or right. Right? He doesn't even know whether what he is doing, or if he knows what he is doing, he has no idea whether it is right or wrong, or he is breaking a law or is not breaking a law. He is totally lost. Right? All this when the intoxication is either against his will or without his knowledge. This is important. The famous benchmark case in this area is the Director of Public Prosecution versus Beard. Dates back to 1920 in the House of Lords, UK. Lord Birkenhead gave this famous judgment where he laid down certain basic principles. The basic principle he gave was that if a man deliberately and knowing takes something that destroys his willpower, then he should be treated like a sober man. He cannot then hide behind the curtain of his having lost his willpower, because it was he who imbibed that which made him lose his willpower. So insanity, whether produced by drunkenness or by unsoundness of mind, is a defense. And it does constitute a defense that he has no specific intent and he could not have formed such an intent, but if he was made to drink, just being made to drink alone is not enough. It should be clear that he was reduced to a state of mind where he could not understand that he was engaging in some act of violent passion. Otherwise, in the natural course, a man is supposed to know the consequences of what he is doing. Remember, during the insanity lecture, we discussed this. The unsoundness should be so great that he is incapable of knowing or having an intent. The same applies to intoxication. The addition is, it should be taken either involuntarily without knowing or under compulsion. If he takes it himself, then as Lord Birkenhead said, if he himself takes it, then he is no better situated in regard to criminal acts than any other sober man. You cannot say, sir, I drank too much willingly and then I lost my sanity, then I did this. It is not a defense. The next section, friends, is 86. An offense which requires a particular intent or knowledge committed by one who is intoxicated. Now, it's a very interesting section. It says, when an act is done is not an offense unless done with a particular knowledge or intent. Yahan tak to theek hai. We have already done in the previous section that he should have either no intent, no idea what he is doing, or he should not have the knowledge of the consequences of that act. This is the first part. Of the second part, what does it say? A person who does this act in a state of intoxication shall be liable to be dealt with as if he had the same knowledge as he would have had if he had not been intoxicated, unless it was administered to him without knowledge or against his will. Now, my point, friends, is the first part of the section speaks of knowledge or intent. The second part of the section, intent disappears altogether and it is only knowledge that remains. Why? What is the logic behind this? Right? So, as I said, first part of the section is speaking of intent or knowledge. Second part is dealing only with knowledge. Why this omission? Does it mean that in a crime committed under insanity, mens rea is immaterial? No, mens rea is not immaterial, friends. The point here is that the man has been drunk to the level of insanity. So intent he has already lost. The only point to be considered then is, could he possibly have had the same knowledge as he would have had if he were not intoxicated? Now, generally, with the law will assume that if a person X, however drunk he may be, has committed an act of crime, an offense, then he should have had the knowledge of what he was doing. This is a presumption that the law will take. Right? So intent may be lost, but he would still have the knowledge, provided this intoxicant again was given to him without his knowledge or against his will. Right? So even though the man may have been made completely, almost insane, totally insane and unsound mind by drinking, that insanity will still not save him if he does an act, because it will be assumed that he may have not known what he was doing, but he would have the knowledge that what he was doing, what effect it would have, that it would harm somebody. That was against the law, unless his drinking has been perforce or without his knowledge. And also, it has reached a stage where it becomes insanity. Fundamental points, my friends. There is a complete identity and linearity between the defense of insanity and the defense of drunkenness, because drunkenness should also take you to that level of that insanity which is required to be a valid defense under the IPC. And I repeat, the only condition attached is that this drunkenness came about not because the accused himself was quaffing the alcohol or whatever, but it was given to him without his knowledge, or he was compelled to take it. Right. There's a famous case of Shankar Jaiswara versus State of Bengal. Right. What was the case? That the only difference between insanity and drunkenness is that drunkenness produces a condition that the mind cannot form a specific intention. As I said in the last section, in this section, the intention gets lost, but it does not mean that he was not aware of the consequences of the act. That is a presumption that will still be made unless it can be proved that this alcoholic excess that he suffered from, which led to the criminal charge, This alcoholic excess was not a result of his own drinking or own imbibing, but was forced upon him or without his knowing, innocently. It was through cheating or deception, it was administered to him. Very clear. I will repeat briefly. Drunkenness and insanity are virtually the same defense. The only difference being drunkenness needs to be proven. It has to be to the limit that a person becomes unsound of mind, where he can neither know what he is doing, have no mens rea, or he should have no knowledge of what he is doing is wrong or it is contrary to law. But the law says, all right, the first part, his intent may disappear, but knowledge also we shall specifically presume that in spite of his drunkenness, he had in the normal course, unless it is again established that this drinking destroyed his power of knowing also. So the intent also goes away, the knowing also goes away. When both disappear because of forced drinking or drinking by deception, then and then alone, this is a valid defense. Now, section 87. Act not intended and not known to be likely to cause death or grievous hurt done by consent. I call it the boxing match section. What happens? In a boxing match, say at the college level or at the state level or whichever level, you wear your gloves, you put on your helmet, you wear your loin guard, whatever you do whatever. Now, when two persons go into the match, they know that they are likely to get hurt. But they also know that it is unlikely to cause either death or grievous hurt. Why? Precautions have been taken, the helmet has been worn, the gloves have been worn, guards have been worn, both are highly trained, physically fit, and have no disease or malady which puts them at risk. And they have both consented. They have both consented to enter into a boxing match. Now, if that happens, and if perchance during the boxing, one boxer delivers a punch to the jaw of another, the second person, say X and Y, X delivers a solid punch to the jaw of Y. Y falls down. In the process, his head bumps against the floor or whatever happens. And there is a blood clot made which travels, and there is a thrombosis in his brain, coronary thrombosis, and he dies. X is not to blame. Y had consented. 99% of the time, every care is taken in a boxing match to ensure that nobody gets grievously hurt or dies. And the physical fitness, etc., both is taken. The training, the capability, the weight. You cannot match a flyweight boxer against a heavyweight boxer. Both have to be flyweight or welterweight or whatever. So if in spite of all this, God forbid, somebody suffers a grievous hurt, and if he is above 18 years of age, and he has given consent, an adult who has consented to the match, all things taken into consideration, no blame shall attach to him. The next section, friends, is section, we'll come to that later. So before that, I'll draw your attention to a maximum taught, voluntae non fit injuria. Those of you who have studied taught would know it very well. To a willing person, no injury is done. Right? So a man who enters into a boxing match is not saying, I consent to die, or to take the risk of dying, or to take the risk of grievous hurt. No. The only risk that he is taking is of being punched and going into a match. That does require, if you get a punch, it's bound to pain somewhere. Having given that consent, it's a matter also of voluntae non fit injuria. So that's a tortious concept, but it can be used here. Now, there is a difference between consent and submission. A consent given freely of your own volition does involve a submission to entering into the match, boxing match. But every submission is not a consent. If somebody puts a gun to my back and makes me submit, I have not consented. I have submitted to pressure. Or if somebody says, your brother is seriously ill, he is dying and he is in my custody, you want him to, be released and cured, you will have to consent to this terrible boxing match. That is, and I go there. I'm submitting to this pressure. I have not consented. So these final differences should be kept in mind by lawyers. Section 88. This is the doctor's section, right? Act not intended to cause death, done by consent in good faith for the person's benefit. So the illustration is also there for doctor, that the surgeon knows that in particular, so suppose it's a very delicate operation involving, say, brain surgery. And the surgeon tells the relatives of the patient or the patient himself that, look, this is a major tumor in your brain. If it is not removed, you are likely to die in so much time. If removed, you will be cured, hopefully. But there is a danger. If we go into your brain and we try to remove this tumor, there is a possibility that however careful we are, right? Though I don't intend to cause your death, the surgeon says, I don't want to kill you, but there is a possibility, right? So the surgeon is acting for the benefit of the patient. The surgeon is acting in good faith, and consent is given for the surgery, whether it is expressed or implied, that okay, please cut open my skull, go into my brain, do whatever you like. It is the harm that the patient or his authorized relatives, next of kin, have decided to risk. And the surgeon, who is a skilled man, who has the capability, takes all possible precautions, the right amount of anesthesia, the right preliminary testing of the patient, the right seeing that the blood pressure, sugar, etc. is all okay. And after doing that, he does the surgery. But very unfortunate, despite all that care, something happens in the brain and the patient dies. Section 88 protects the surgeon here. So I call it the doctor section. The famous case here again is Bolam versus Friar Hospital Committee. Right? So was the surgeon negligent? If the surgeon was negligent, what is the parameter by which you will try to establish this negligence? Did he not exercise all caution? Did he not use your skill? So negligence in law means some failure to do some act which a reasonable man in the circumstances would either do, or doing something which a reasonable man would not do. So a surgeon who goes in for a surgery, a reasonable doctor would take the blood pressure, would check for sugar, would check for any other disorder which could, interfere with the success of the surgery. He would do that. As a reasonable man, as a reasonable surgeon, he should be doing that. What he should not be doing, he should not be doing things like letting the anesthetist under anesthetize the man. Right? He is not supposed to omit the care which goes into the applying of the anesthetic. So it is not always that the doctor has to be highest skill. We are only going to take the world's best doctor for a surgery. No. It is enough that if he is qualified, he is competent, he has the degree and he has the skill as expected in law to practice surgery. So it is not, this gentleman was a surgeon, but he was not a surgeon from All India Institute of 30 years standing, so he should not have operated. Sorry, no. If he has done his MS in surgery, he has specialized in that branch of surgery, he is a qualified man, so he is supposed to have that skill. After which, if he has not done something which he should not have done, or if he has, done something which he should not have done, that case can come out during a trial. Right? Section 89. Now, act done in good faith for the benefit of a child or insane person by the consent of the guardian. This is a specialized section. Suppose a child has a problem and a child cannot take a decision under 12 or whatever. If the child is under 12, he or she cannot take a decision and there has to be a surgical procedure again or some other procedure, or he or she has to be sent to some special place for psychiatric care or whatever, if he's an unsound mind, then if the guardian or whoever has lawful custody of an insane person or a child may give the consent. Consent may be expressed or it may be implied. If after giving the consent, the child or the insane person suffers some harm, you cannot blame the person concerned for doing it. Take, for example, an insane person. An insane person is sent to the lunatic asylum with the consent of those who are his guardians or who are lawful custody of the insane person. Okay. Now he goes there. Now there a certain tranquilizer is given. Okay. Now this tranquilizer, all tests are done, everything care is taken, but when this insane person takes this tranquilizer, somehow or the other his system does not take it and he cannot come out of the coma. He goes into coma. Right? The doctors in the lunatic asylum who administered the tranquilizer to him after taking all care cannot be blamed. There was a consent by the lawful guardian of the person or the person lawfully in charge of that insane man. The right step was taken, the right medication was given, yet this happened. So there are certain provisos. The person who is accused in this case, no consent can be given to cause death or attempting to cause death. Okay. So the guardian of the child cannot say, Kisab, isko, please you take him into the surgery and then you calmly take his heart out. Or you kill him on the operation table. It is only to do good to that person. So it cannot intend to the causing of death or attempting to cause death. Also, the person to whom the authority is given to cause that harm, say the doctor or the surgeon in this case, he should not do anything which he knows is likely to cause death other than to prevent death or grievous hurt. So as I said before, if this surgeon, say, cuts open the heart and he does a heart transplant. Now, normally he would know that it could cause death. But why is he doing a heart transplant? He's doing a heart transplant because he's hoping to prevent the death of that man by giving him a new heart. Right? That man has a tremendous heart disease and he cannot continue with this heart. So he puts in another heart and he knows that this may also likely cause death. Because as you know, the acceptance or rejection of the heart is more a throw of the dice, more a matter of chance, but it has to be done. Similarly, it cannot extend to causing grievous hurt or attempting to cause grievous hurt. Same logic. It shall not extend to the abatement of any offense, where the committing of the offense itself does not get this exception. Right? So, if a child or an insane person is admitted to a hospital, and if the guardian of that insane person wants that child or that insane person done away with, suppose the insane person has a lot of property, and this so-called guardian will inherit all that property, and he tells the doctor, "Ki isko yaar, finish him off on the table." Now the other persons who are with the doctor, the anesthesiologist or whoever, if they know that this is what the doctor is going to do or is doing, then they are abettors. And they are abettors to the same extent as the doctor himself. Right? So this is section 89. So this is all for now, friends. And next time, we shall go on to the other sections. I hope everything is clear in what we have discussed today. Thank you very much.